So we have some guests, thanks for joining us, but to that class, it's our last class, so I just want to say, Professor Gossman will walk in at any point, but here he is right now. But I guess speaking for both of us, unless he has his own words, I just want to say it's been a great semester with all of you. In the last week, I've heard
I never have my own words because you're so...
In the last week, I heard from a student I taught in the Colloquium 2 years ago and another student I taught last year. And I love it when people come back and reach out. And so at any time, we're here to help you over the course of your time here at the Law Center or after. So let us know, but hopefully it's been a good experience.
And we actually had one of the presenters was a former student in the Colloquium.
Right.
So,
That's very cool.
good.
And now we'll turn it over to Professor Tim Westmoreland, who'll pick it up for us.
These guys are going to laugh at Professor. Larry, do you want to say something in farewell to your class? Or
No, actually, you're good at putting these things well, better than me anyway, so you go for it.
Okay,
Yeah,
thanks.
I think you know a little bit more about the ACA than I do, although whether you know what this guy's going to do.
I think that's quite clear that I don't know. My name is Tim Westmoreland, for those of you whom I haven't had as students. I look around the room and see a number of you that I have. I teach about health law and about budget law and about statutory interpretation here. But today, I'm not the speaker. I'm just the guy who keeps it rolling a little bit. And we are honored to have with us two people who really are in the midst of these things on a regular basis. We have Ann Dwyer, who's here as the counsel for Senator Wyden on the Senate Finance Committee. She has been with Mr. Wyden for a while now, but she comes from a legal background of having worked for the National Health Law Program, among others, in the past. And she approaches these things as Mr. Wyden does, but also as a health lawyer. So she may have some particular insights for you guys. And then Dr. Rodney Whitlock, who is the former staff director for the Senate Finance Committee on Health Issues. I said that wrong. Former staff director for health issues for the Senate Finance Committee for Chairman Grassley. And he's been doing this almost, but not quite as long as I've been doing this. Not quite. And he has worked on a wide variety of issues, many times working on them in a bipartisan manner, but most notably for my purposes, having worked on the Patient Bill of Rights for years and years too. So I'm hoping between the two of them, who have across the aisle views in the greatest deliberative body of the world, that we'll be able to have some conversations about what the ACA might expect, what we might expect of the ACA over the coming first few months, then over the longer mid-range, and then in the long range, what people might have as a vision for health insurance in the U.S. But I do want to start with the ground rule. That we're going to have this conversation in civil tones, and we're not going to be having high-flung political rhetoric, unless these guys want to. But you guys and I will not be having this in turn.
Rodney and I are very high-flung. So.
That's it. Middle name, high flung.
So I think everybody can say that they were, I assume, I didn't ask you this question, but I think everybody can say that they were surprised by the outcome of the election.
We were on our side.
Surprised, not shocked. I'd put out some stuff the day before saying, hey, don't be surprised if it's nail biting. I did not say that would be the outcome, but a former faculty member at my alma mater has run polling in Virginia, and I talked to him a few days before, and he told me that he was just terrified his panels were wrong, because he was coming 10 days out, he had her up 18 in Virginia. And he just knew that was not right. And I think we all now know that everybody polling had completely drawn bad samples throughout. So I at least had was able to tell some folks, hey, you might not be going to bed at 10.
Or at all. So Rodney was surprised, not shocked. I assume you were shocked.
I think there was a fair amount of shock. I think, a lot of people, traditionally the polls have been mostly in the right trajectory. And so I think there was a question of whether we would keep the Senate or take back the Senate, or the Senate would remain in majority control. But I think in terms of the presidency, it was, I think, shock was for the majority of people, I think, in the minority side. And so I think, you know, the day after, we said there was how many stages of grief, like denial, anger,
Depression, bargaining, and acceptance.
bargaining. I think I've been trying to figure out like what stage I am now. I think I'm like bargaining/acceptance. But I think, you know, obviously different people are at different stages in that spectrum at this point.
Well, if it's any comfort, Dr. Kubler-Ross said that they could all appear at the same time. They could go back and forth.
Okay. I never
Be a
imagined that'll be
constellation
the
of them.
case.
You don't have to experience some seriatim. But now, having overcome our surprise and our shock, as we're pulling together the pieces to try to figure out what this means for healthcare in the U.S., I think I'd first like to turn to Rodney and say, the repeal and replace motto that has prevailed on the Republican side of the aisle in both House and the Senate, how's it going to go?
So I'll sort of pull out some of the things that I've been saying publicly. So since plus or minus 3 a.m. on the night. So first, repeal and replace is a slogan. Always was. It's not the way that sounds is and never was realistic. So what Republicans want to do, if you ask them, is they want to provide coverage for folks with private insurers competing to provide the highest quality care and the most efficient in terms of the care provided and the lowest possible cost. In 2009, when I was around for that, it sort of sounded like what the Democrats were trying to do. And so, I continually describe Republicans, when they get away from the slogans, are really talking about a transition. They want to transition from what they see in the Affordable Care Act to their version of it. Now, what does that involve? How is that going to go? If I had that crystal ball, it'd be a lot easier. But I think you have to start there. The distance between where Republicans are talking and where the ACA is an Uber ride. I mean, look at Medicare. The distance between Medicare and, say, premium support, you better pack luggage, because that's a long damn ride. And so, if you look at where things are, what Republicans are going to get to is the recognition that ultimately it is a transition. And the line I like to use to remind folks is, listen, there are no solutions here. Thomas Sowell's great quote, okay? There are no solutions, there are only trade-offs. Well, there are no solutions here. It's just a set of trade-offs. And the Affordable Care Act is effectively the Democrats' version of their trade-offs they made to try to cover people. And now Republicans get the opportunity to do their version of it. And they're going to have to set up the trade-offs, and they're going to have to own the consequences of it.
Okay, let me stop you there, though, and ask the sort of end game question. There are 20 million people covered one way or another between Medicaid and the exchanges. Do you think that it's a Republican goal to have as many people covered at the end of the day?
So I really actually thought your question was going to be, yes, but aren't they batshit crazy?
Only if you were Lindsey Graham would I ask that question.
Okay. I think that Republicans have to do 3 things. 1, they have to talk to insurers, because if you want to cover people, you ought to talk to the people who do it. And if you're not going to do what insurers say, you better have a damn good reason. I was in rooms in 2009. I heard folks say, you cannot have a stable marketplace if your rating bands are below 8 to 1. Okay? And they ended up 3 to 1. Okay? The decisions were made to not listen to folks who said this. Okay? Republicans have the same opportunity to listen to insurers and decide whether or not they want to pay attention or ignore. Second, and this is really actually arguably the biggest one, Republicans have been completely invested in disruption for 7 years. That's been the party motto. We are here to disrupt. We're not here to make anything work. We're here to make sure that things go awry. We're here to make the wheels fall off. Now they own it. Disruption is now bad. Disruption is not good. Disruption is your problem. And I think Republicans are going to have to get their mind wrapped around that problem. Some of them are already there. You can listen to an Alexander, you can listen to a Barrasso. You know, there's some folks who get it. In particular, you want to know who the folks are that get it, are the folks that worked on King versus Burwell. Because that was a immediate, obliterating destruction, moment one, if it had gone the other way. And so the folks on the Republican side who were trying to be ready for that moment are the ones who are speaking now about disruption. But Republicans have got to get their minds out of this whole, it's disruption, disruption, disruption. Now they actually own the disruption, and it makes them look bad when there is disruption. Third and finally, and this gets to where you're going, Tim. If I were Paul Ryan, I would go to CBO, let them know so that way they could get their minds right, that they are about to work them like a rented mule, that they are going to give them every option under the sun, and they're going to want the cost and coverage consequences laid out for everyone. They have never had a white paper scored. White papers are ambiguous in nature, with all love and respect
About 3
to,
paragraphs in policy for most of them.
Yeah,
too.
yeah. And you look at it and go, okay, that's
I'm
not.
sorry, for those of us who've never worked for the greatest deliberative body in the world, unpack what a white paper is. It's like a chairman's mark kind of
No,
thing?
no, no, this is, the House of Representatives put out, it's sort of a, this is our general goals document. It's not a legislative language by any stretch of the imagination. It's sort of what we think we will do. And in there, it is sort of to the eye of the beholder. It's a variation on an ink blot test. You know, is that an owl? Is it a VW Beetle? Is it a late enrollment penalty? I can't quite tell. And you don't get to do that anymore. Now they have to deal with the real consequences of their decisions. And I think one of the challenges will be is folks who are, I'm going to use this gently, who are less intelligent about healthcare are going to be stuck with this reality that CBO is telling them, actually, in fact, if you take away the matching rate that was in the Affordable Care Act for Medicaid, states will quit. They will. They don't have the resources to be able to backfill when that money goes away. Now, you've been saying you've believed in it, but now you're being told it will cost millions and millions of people their coverage. What are you going to do? That part we haven't gotten to that part yet.
Okay, let me ask more concisely. Do you think one of the goals for the current Republicans in the Senate, and maybe for the administration too, to the extent that you prognosticate, is to have at least as many people covered with health insurance at the end of the day? Or is that one of the moving variables that we might look to see how much it costs, we might look to see how much coverage we get, we might look to see how many low-income people versus middle-income people?
In 2009, the only thing that matters was the coverage number. And that was, I mean, and that's a policy choice.
Right.
I don't think it's the only thing that matters to Republicans.
Okay.
That I will say. But then that trade-off, we're going to find out.
Yeah. Ann?
Yes, can I say, Rodney, as I've said before, we miss you in the Senate.
yeah.
Please come back.
Yes, we do miss Rodney.
Oh, no.
We do miss Rodney in the
Yes.
Senate. If for nothing other than the phrases like working like a rented mule, where phrases you don't get that often in the Senate Finance Committee. But, Ann,
Yes.
do you think 20 million people covered, as it currently is under the ACA, is one of the sine qua non goals for the Democrats?
Yes, I think it is one of the main goals, if not the goal. As Rodney said, in 2009, it was the main goal. I think, obviously, when the Supreme Court said that Medicaid expansion was an option for states, that was a big disappointment for a number of members. And I think they saw that as a challenge to their goal. That's why they've been pushing so hard to get states to optionally pick up the Medicaid expansion. At the same time, I think a number of members will acknowledge and recognize, my boss included, that the ACA is imperfect, that we made trade-offs, we made policy decisions. I was not around when they were doing it, but when they had to use certain procedural processes to get it done, there were some gaps. There was things like the family glitch. that needed to be addressed. And so I think the challenge has been, since 2010, I think Democrats have been looking for the opportunity to work with the other side to say, look, can we all acknowledge it's not perfect, and can we move on and identify opportunities for improvements and things to make it work a little better? Maybe 3-to-1 age rating isn't working, but can we have a good faith conversation about that? Unfortunately, I think neither side has been able to kind of come to the table on that. I think the majority has been very focused on repeal votes. They've done, I don't know, a few dozen, 40, 50 at this point. And I think the Democrats have been unwilling to publicly say there's issues because they know the other side is also going to use that against them. And so that has been and remains a huge challenge. However, I think all of that is almost a secondary note at this point, because we now have a new administration. We have a Republican Senate, controlled Senate. We have a Republican-controlled House. I'm sure you may have all read in the news, there's unique procedural mechanisms that the majority can use, where a 60-vote threshold, which is kind of the traditional threshold you need in the Senate, which would require a Democratic vote, you can get around that through budget reconciliation measures. And so in 2015, the majority repealed the individual mandate, repealed the employer mandate, I think zeroed out the tax credits, repealed Medicaid expansion, defunded Planned Parenthood for a year, and they were successfully able to pass that package through the budget reconciliation process out of the Senate and the House and send it to the president's desk. Now, we had a president that vetoed that package, but I think, of course, now we hope that the President-elect Trump, given his campaign promises around ensuring people, we can protect Medicaid and protect Medicare, and that there isn't disruption. We'd hope that that wouldn't happen again, but I think right now, from what we're hearing, that is their plan, is to basically, out of the gate in January, take that same package that we saw in 2015, that repeal package, and pass it. I think we're also expecting a 2-year delay of that. And so I think one question has been, if the slogan is repeal and replace, let's see what the replacement plan is, so we can have those conversations about, okay, there's trade-offs, let's see what your trade-offs are, let's see what you're thinking about. But right now, it doesn't sound like that replacement part is going to be part of the repeal that we're going to see in probably early next year. So the answer is yes for the Dems.
Yes for the Dems, hold on to 20 million and wait and see about replace. For both of you, I understand the idea of taking last year's dry run budget reconciliation bill, of repealing and putting a 2-year moratorium on, or a delay of 2 years in the effective date. Do you think insurance companies will stay in the exchanges if they're looking at that horizon where wheels are beginning to come off of the moving vehicle? If I can try to steal one of your phrases.
Go for it.
I think from the Democratic perspective, we don't want disruptions in coverage, so we hope that the market is able to be stable for the millions of Americans that depend on it. From a pure business perspective, I don't know how I create a bid for a plan if I don't know if that plan is going to be offered next year. And so, especially when the marketplace is, for some plans, they've been very successful for some plans, especially plans that are used to operating in the Medicaid markets and are offering in the exchange markets, they've been very successful for them. And for some other plans that were very used to employer-sponsored coverage, that were not used to serving a lower income, sicker population, have been a bit more of a challenge. So I think it's also unclear how some of those plans that have been holding out until the market stabilizes, this is the opposite of market stabilization. So from a pure business perspective, I just don't see how, I could see many of them questioning whether they want to stay in the market.
So if it's repeal with a 2-year delayed effective date, do they stay in?
No, I sort of go back to where I said, which is that if I'm Republican leadership at a committee level, at the congressional level, or in the administration, I spend a lot of time at 601 Pennsylvania Avenue. 601 Pennsylvania Avenue is the home of AHIP, the America's Health Insurance Plans. I say it that way because you show them how serious you are by going to them instead of saying, come kiss the ring. I think that is, if Republicans want to do it correctly, that's how you have to approach it, which is, we're serious, let us show you how serious we are by engaging them. Because that will give them the opportunity to I mean, listen, they stay right now, they're getting killed anyway, in many, many places.
The insurance plans.
Insurers are struggling in many places. The market just didn't turn out as expected. Statement. And so it's not like they're sitting there going, Well, don't fool with anything because it's going so well in a lot of places. And so the sell is to go to them and go, okay, now we're going to work with you to actually make it better. And I'll throw this out here because it's been, how long have we been at this and I haven't said anything ludicrously controversial?
Longer than I've known you.
Yeah, no, I'm getting old. Okay, so there are a lot of folks out there who conceptually are not capable of believing Republicans can do better. They could. They absolutely could. They absolutely could. And by better, I mean produce a higher coverage number. I mean, I'm somebody who looks at the, okay, you got to get the the young immortals in. The young immortals are not participating at the rate. You have 2 bites at the apple, one with the individual mandate, which you hate, turn it into a late enrollment penalty. Could you then, while doing so and lowering premiums at the same time, could you make it really attractive, particularly if you want to lower it for the, again, the young immortals, you expand the rating bands. You have a shot at getting them in a way that they're not being attracted now. And in the Medicaid space, I'm not, the two of you I know are Medicaid experts, and I know that you're not madly in love with what I'm about to say here, but if you decide not to fool with the underlying structure and go hog wild on waivers to the states that aren't in, you might actually get them in. And again, you would hate how those waivers look. You wouldn't have approved it in a billion years, but it could be done.
And it could end up with coverage. The question is what kind of coverage it produces at the end of the day. I do want to take this moment and say, of course, I believe that Republicans could perhaps do better. Mr. Nixon's health plan looks pretty darn good right now. So, no, I have no doubts that Republicans
So
could do
for
better.
those of you in the room, Nixon was a president back 50 years ago who was really a bad man. I mean,
But he had
even
a
worse than this
really
guy.
generous health insurance proposal, which the Democrats walked away from because it wasn't good enough at the time. So, let's go to Medicaid for a second, because Ann and I really do talk about Medicaid a lot.
As do you, Rodney.
Oh, I know.
31 states have expanded, 19 states have not. Most of the states that have not are deep red. That produces, if you repeal it altogether, the Medicaid expansion, that produces 31 state losers.
Correct.
If you continue it, freeze it in place as it is now, just grandfather everything in, you've got 31 states static and 19 people who feel like they've lost because they didn't get in. And if you open it up to the other states at this point, it's going to cost a whole lot of money for 19 new states coming in. What do you see in the winners, losers, freeze at current expansion, close down the expansion? Where is this debate headed?
So I think, well, there's where we think it might be headed and where we'd like it to be headed.
Okay, you can do either one first.
So I think, why don't I start with where we'd like it to be headed? So to the extent that a state now chooses to expand, they will still get the enhanced FMAP that's available to them today. And so moving forward, that's largely 90% FMAP. So for every dollar they spend on that individual, 90 cents of it is covered by the federal government for the medical services. And so we've seen a lot of focus on the opioid epidemic. We've seen a lot of focus on mental health issues, people saying that these are ravaging state budgets. What we also know is there's 2 million people with behavioral health issues who are uninsured and low income in states that haven't expanded. So if I'm a state that's looking to decrease ER admits and get these people health, Medicaid expansion actually seems like a pretty good deal. So I think for us, we would like to continue to work with the states to find paths forward. I think the administration has been very flexible with a number of states. Indiana's a good example. Arkansas is a good example. Have they been as flexible as some of the states would like them to be? No. And I think that's what we would say in terms of the flexibility is that they were ensuring that there's really important consumer protection still there. Medicaid has never had a work requirement. Medicaid is a health insurance program. One of the key goals of the ACA was to move health insurance away from being tied exclusively to employment. On top of that, majority of people who are Medicaid expansion individuals are in a family with a working individual. People that aren't working, oftentimes taking care of loved ones, they have children, they have elderly parents. Many of them have substance use, behavioral health issues. And so for us, we would like to find a way to work with states to continue to expand, to continue to increase the numbers of expansion states. Where we think it's headed, the majority has been so far pretty clear that they intend to repeal Medicaid expansion as part of their repeal plan in January, February, with likely a delayed implementation date. I think the question is then what do they come back with in terms of the replacement? Is the replacement offer states the same deal they were getting before, a different deal, to the extent they're offering states a different deal? Some states have said they would like more flexibility, but what is going to be the, to the extent the federal government's giving them more flexibility, whatever that means, the federal government's going to want to say, hey, but our part of the deal is we don't have to pay as much. And so I think until we kind of see what's the devil in the details, it's going to be hard for us to really know what their plans are. That being said, Medicaid is an extremely lean program. It's a very efficient program to the extent that the goal is budgetary driven and it's to cut, I think, Chairman Price, the new HHS Secretary nominee, he proposed in his last budget to cut $2.1 trillion from the Medicaid program over the next 10 years. And so, and enhance state flexibility. But I don't know that any level of state flexibility is going to make up for a 30% cut out of the program. So I think that's what we're kind of waiting to see what that looks like later this year.
Okay, 19 states that haven't expanded, most of them deep red. They don't get any of the money that's been on the table. Does the incoming Senate care about that? Does the incoming administration?
I think this is going to be part of the trade-off conversation that they have to have. Because I was there in '09 when we were having those trade-off conversations, where it became, if you don't pay for 100% of it, the states are gone. To which those of us who are a long time working on Medicaid said, no. You will do what we tell you to do. You don't get to have that authority. And John Roberts went and screwed everything up by actually giving them the ability to say no. And so Republicans are going to be faced with that. And I mean, as somebody who enjoys talking Medicaid as much as you guys, I still to this day struggle trying to wrap my mind around how much the NFIB versus Sebelius decision messed up Medicaid. Because the federal role now is just radically different. It's been now 7 years and no one has even stuck a toe in the concept of, okay, what do you think we can make states do now? Do we have the authority to make them do anything or not? And I think that's Republicans are going to face that because I don't think it's their nature anyway to say make you do things, but they're going to have to start dealing with, okay, if we provide you these incentives, what will you do? And again, it's going to be part of that process they go through where they're going to have to talk to the Congressional Budget Office to have the Congressional Budget Office go, it ain't going to work.
Right.
And then decide do they really want to follow through. And Medicaid really is probably, if you think about it, is the biggest area Republicans are going to have to deal with making hard choices and accepting what they are told, because they have spent so much time in echo chambers of people talking to each other. They don't get to do that anymore. They now actually, it ain't no more white papers. It isn't slogans. This is a real exercise, live, here you go, now tell us what the consequence is. And they're going to have to actually own those decisions.
When the Senate did the dry run of reconciliation last year to be vetoed by Mr. Obama, at the time, with the Medicaid expansion repeal, there were at least 3 Republican senators at that time who were still senators who said that they were uncomfortable with the idea because their home state has already expanded Medicaid. And they were reassured that they could vote yes on this bill because, of course, Mr. Obama would be vetoing the bill. Now, we have no assurance, in fact, quite the contrary, that Mr. Trump would veto the bill. Are there Republican senators, I'm going to turn to you first for Republican senators. Are there Republican senators who will oppose repealing the Medicaid expansion because their home states are getting so much help from it?
I mean, I hope so. But the reality is they only need 50 votes because the vice president's the tiebreaker, so they can lose 2 and still do it. So whether they can lose more than 2, I think, is a question. I think we've been encouraging state stakeholders, the governor's offices, state Medicaid directors, to the extent that they're concerned that their programs are about to get blown up. They come talking to me, I'm like, it's great, I'm happy to come talk to you, but you need to go talking to those guys. And so I think, at this point, it's up to the stakeholders in large part. It's largely up to the Republican governors and Republican appointed Medicaid directors to weigh in with those members and really talk to them about kind of the consequences of some of these actions. And I think that goes more largely to this idea of ACA repeal without replacement. And I think from a pure procedural perspective, when they did the ACA, they had hearings, they had markups, they had floor debate. They're talking about taking away coverage for 20 million Americans without a single hearing, without a single markup. And so I think there's, just from a pure procedural perspective, something to be said about there being ample opportunity for stakeholders to weigh in and then also to see what the replacement is.
Do you think Republican senators who come from Medicaid expansion states are going to vote to take that money away from their state?
No, I don't think they'll vote to take the money away. I think where the decision is going to be, what does the next configuration look like? And what are they going to be told about its effect on cost and coverage?
I don't understand that last thing.
Okay, so this isn't the only way to do it. There are other ways to get at it. One of the ones that I was knocking around before the election was, what if you went to Republicans and said, we'll let you do per capita caps as a state option, but you got to cover the newly eligibles. How many states would be in for that? Don't know that they would be, but all I'm saying is that's a different configuration. If I set up the dollars right, your coverage number might not look radically different. And certainly the state consequence is not going to look radically different if you do it the right way. Listen, what's about to happen, and it's, get some popcorn and pull up a chair and watch, is you're gonna have this incredible fight amongst Republicans between those who believe that the sky is green and those who actually understand what the hell they're talking about.
You want to name names?
Heritage is a great place to start. They're like, you go that way, and the sky is green over their building. So just look, it's, because they make up shit all the time. It's not actually grounded in any actual reality, but God, it must be nice to be able to do that.
I'll repeat, we miss you, Rodney.
They stopped visiting me however many years ago, post ACA, that I walked them in, and it was Nina. I just blew her up. I just like, okay, but why doesn't this work? Okay, we're not going to visit you in again. And so, yeah, you're going to listen, those battles are going to go on, and there are folks who actually do treat reality as objective, and they're going to be battling with those that treat reality as subjective.
You remind me that when I was at Medicaid, I had a state Medicaid director who one time told me, when Republicans are in charge, they'll give me flexibility but no money. When Democrats are in charge, they'll give me money but no flexibility. Do you think there's anybody who would give me a little flexibility and a little money? And do you think this administration is going to be willing to do a little money to go with a little flexibility, or is it total handoff of the reins? You're in charge, but we're going to cap how much money you get from the federal government.
And that's what they're going to have to deal with, which is the classic line. Well, and you talk about the budget and numbers, which are utterly ridiculous. My long-time line has been that if you tell states that we're going to give you flexibility, and in return we're going to take $700 billion back from you, the states will say, no, actually, you keep your flexibility, we'll keep our $700 billion. And that's going to occur regardless of the color of the state. It's red state, blue state, that is going to occur. No one can lose that kind of money. It's when do they get in a realistic conversation. And a great example, if I can push it a little here, which is, I am not somebody who is necessarily a believer in the concept of block granting or per capita caps. But what I do always like to walk people through is they're not inherently evil. You know, I can write a block grant or per capita cap you'd love. Okay, wouldn't save any money. And what it would do is it would cause states to have to figure out, okay, how do we do this without gaming the system? Because our whole program is built on gaming the system. With all love and respect for the work you did when you were there, and we don't have.
I don't disagree.
We don't have any IGTs. We don't need to use provider taxes. I mean, provider taxes to me are like the greatest example of a scam. Whoever lobbies you to be taxed more, other than Medicaid providers for their provider
Okay, I
taxes.
feel like I need to step back for 1 second because this is not a health finance class.
I'm sorry. I'll rein it back in.
The long and the short of it is that states taxed healthcare providers so that they could use that money to get an increased federal match, so they could get billions of dollars into the state, which the state would then use to pay the providers extra,
Or build stadiums.
or build stadiums, or
roads.
both.
Or bridges.
But the effect of it was to make more and more of the money in the Medicaid program federal money, without very much, and a decreasing level of it state money. That's now illegal for the most part, but it wasn't illegal at the time that they were doing it.
It's not illegal. It's capped.
Yes, it's true. What I said when I
So
left,
cap the illegal behavior.
what I said when I left HHS was, if I'd known how little health policy and how much banking was in this job, I might never have taken it. But I think that's the same thing again. So I'm still looking for an answer of, there are states with Republican senators that will be losers under a repeal proposal. There are states with Democratic senators that are winners under perhaps a grandfathering in a freeze proposal. Do Republican senators leave their majority in order to save money for their home states?
I think
Or I'm sorry, let me not be so crass as to save money. To keep coverage of low-income people in their home states?
I like the way
the money was the more relevant question.
See, it's all about banking, I'm telling you.
I think it depends on what they're told by their leadership about promises about whether the replacement plan will solve their problems.
And we're 700 billion? No way. Republicans at that point will go, no, we can't do that. So the numbers that have been bandied about in meaningless show votes, people have voted for that. If it's a real live exercise, no.
There's my answer. That's what I was looking for. And you agree with that?
Yes, I hope so.
You hope so.
Well, I think there is a concern that given budget reconciliation rules, because there are no hearings, there are no markups, to the extent that leadership from a purely political perspective wanted to shove a really bad proposal down our throats very quickly, and to the point where more moderate members who are not involved in those political decisions do not have time to fully, that stakeholders do not have time to fully get a sense of the consequences, get that message to their members, and have the members react. I think that's what we're concerned about is, and we've told stakeholders, is if you're waiting until there's pen on paper, it's too late, because they could show up 24 hours before this thing hits the floor and drop it, having already sat down with the parliamentarian and gone through all of their burnable, procedural arguments. And so I think that's what makes us most concerned, is that the lack of process and transparency around all this. Now, do I think that they're going to cut, $1 trillion from the program overnight and not have consequences? I really hope I'm wrong, but in a worst case scenario, that is possible. Now, Ron, you're good.
No, I just have to point out to you that process you described just sounds a whole lot like March 2010 to me. And that's, and we're about to see that process. Is it a real impediment, or is it just a speed bump? And I lean towards speed bump. That's one I will warn folks about.
Okay, one last question before I start turning it over for these guys to ask questions. Repeal and replace may or may not, won't discuss the internal workings of the Senate procedure for the moment, include repealing the insurance reforms, the market reforms, for things like no pre-existing condition exclusions, no lifetime or annual caps, those kinds of things. If they're repealed, a lot of industry people, a lot of conservative health economics people, as well as liberal people, say, ooh, this market's going to totally fall apart. We'll be in a death spiral where the only people who want to spend that much money will be people who really use health insurance. And if those are the only people there, then the price goes up again and it spirals. Mr. Trump has said he'd like to keep some of those insurance reforms. In past iterations, some of the Republican members have said they'd like to keep the best of the ACA, meaning insurance reforms, and repeal the other stuff. Can you imagine a situation in which the repeal and replace legislation, leave aside the Senate procedure for a second, repeal and replace legislation leaves the insurance reforms in place but takes down the other stuff? Like last year's dry run did in reconciliation?
But, okay, I believe that Republicans now respect the three-legged stool. All right, so-
Okay, you're going to have to unpack for people what the three-legged stool is here.
Okay, so there's.
And there are four
The
legs.
theory goes, what's the fourth? Okay, all right, then you tell me where I missed it. All right, the theory is if you want to change the system to cause coverage, you need to have all three legs of the stool. Like one is you have to change the marketplace rules such that you don't give insurers the ability to be able to exclude people. Because if you give the insurers the ability to exclude people because they're sick, they will. And it's not because insurers are evil. They're neither good nor evil. They're simply creatures of their regulatory environment. They make more money on healthy people, less money on sick people, and so they prefer the sick people to go away. And if you give them the ability to do so, they happily let them go away. Okay, so you take away those abilities and they go, well, shit, we have to make this work and we'll do it anyway. But you have to put in rules that prevent insurers from excluding individuals who are bad risks, like one. Like two, it takes a shitload of money because healthcare is expensive, and so you're going to have to use tax credits, you're going to have to use advanceables, you're going to have to give a lot of people a lot of money to pay for it. And the Affordable Care Act does that already. And then the third and finally, you have to have a mechanism to cause participation. And so whether it's a late enrollment penalty, whether it's an individual mandate, whether it's we will put you in jail, pick one, but you have to have a mechanism to cause participation because that gets your young immortals in. Right? I believe that Republicans actually, if you look at the Burr-Coburn-Hatch or Burr-Hatch-Upton or whatever, if you look at the Better Way, you can see in there, even if they don't want to admit it, that they recognize the existence of the three-legged stool.
Can you imagine a situation in which we keep health insurance reforms on the books but get rid of everything else, knowing that the insurance market could collapse?
So I think as a general principle, to Rodney's point, just to simplify, if you want your cake, you have to eat your vegetables. And I think the devil's in the details of keeping the reforms on the books, right? So maybe you don't have exchanges, maybe they do high-risk pools. And maybe the affordability is not premium tax credits, but HRAs that are deductible. And so I think it depends too on kind of what the cake looks like and what the vegetable look like. Could it be done? I think maybe. Will people's coverage be as affordable? Questionable. Will as many people be covered? Who knows? I think the devil's in the details. I think we know what the options are out there in terms of design of. I think I would say generally of healthcare. I don't know if there's been a ton of new ideas floated in the last 10 or 20 years. And so when we did the ACA, I mean, you know better than I do, right? Of that menu of options, they picked a few that they were hoping would work together. And whether the Republicans come to the table and pick a few that they hope work together, I think is to be determined. That being said, I think that we've seen evidence that HRAs and high-risk pools, they had waiting lists. HRAs don't really help low-income people who don't file taxes. And so I think that those are some of the things that we're concerned about that maybe from the majority perspective are not some of their primary concerns.
Okay. Jeff, Larry, can I give you the prerogative of asking a couple of questions to begin
They
with?
both jumped up. It's
I actually think we should maybe go to a break.
Oh,
Can I just ask one clarifying
Sure.
question before we
I
do?
didn't know there was a break.
Just a clarifying question, because so just so I understand it and the class understands it, just correct me if I'm wrong, I misstated. So what we've been talking about in terms of the last time it went up to the president's desk using reconciliation. Flat out repeal of everything, but it would be delayed for 2 years while there was a replacement. That's the first part,
Right.
1A. And part 1B is that can the reconciliation process allow for that in the sense that it's all a budgetary issue? And are there any procedural or other problems with that? Those are really my, two clarifying questions before.
I just taught this in my budget class yesterday, and I had Bill Hoagland, the former Republican staff director from the Budget Committee in the Senate, there to talk as well. So let me take a stab at it.
Are you doing 1A or B?
I'm going to do both.
You do both, okay.
And then you guys critique, and I'm not shy, so and I know you're not shy,
No
so.
fear.
The dry run, what I keep calling the dry run, last year's reconciliation bill that was passed with 51, well, I don't know how many votes it had, but could be passed with 51 votes without the 60-vote filibuster, included within it the repeal of almost everything except the insurance reforms. The insurance reforms on the
Pre-existing condition.
the pre-existing condition, the lifetime caps, the kids on policy till age 26, those kinds of things were not repealed. There is widespread speculation, but as best I know, no evidence out there, that the reason that the majority leader did not include those insurance reforms last year was because they would not have survived a parliamentary review of whether those provisions had a direct effect on revenue or spending that was not merely incidental to another purpose. And consequently, they didn't include them.
That was the only reason.
That's the widespread speculation. Nobody's, as far as I know, nobody's ever said point blank from the Republican side that that's the reason we left it out. Rodney, do you know if anybody said point blank?
No, and I think you're correct, and that, that the goal was always to prove that they could get as much as possible. I mean, the goal has always been, the Affordable Care Act is repealed, done. And that's been the political goal. The policy goal is a much more complicated question. I'm gonna take where you went, and I'm gonna throw a different curveball at you, and I know Ann is not going to want to hear this. I don't believe that the rules are an issue. I just don't, because the precedent has been set in the Senate that if the leader doesn't like the rules, the leader can change the rules. And, I don't know if it'll be across the board, but I do not see Mitch McConnell turning to the Republican electorate, the Republican rank and file, and this president and saying, I would love for us to be able to do this, but Chuck Schumer said no.
So if I could, let me just translate for a second. It takes 67 votes to formally amend the Senate rules. Nobody has 67 votes to eliminate the filibuster in general. It would take 60 votes to bypass the filibuster. Nobody has 60 votes to do these things right now. I think, and you guys, it's odd for me. I've only worked for the People's House. I've never worked for the greatest deliberative body of the world. But
Fine grace. That's another conversation.
not my kind. But what I think Rodney is describing is that there is a possibility through a series of rulings by, do you call him chair or president at that point? By the person who's sitting in the middle of the room, there's a possibility of a series of rulings which might reinterpret the Senate rules either for a very specific set of cases or across the board, no longer to allow a filibuster of some of these issues, even if they don't have a direct effect on revenue or spending. It is what Mr. Reid did a few years ago about getting Democratic nominees approved with fewer than 60 votes, the so-called nuclear option. At that time, however, the Democrats were quite clear that they were only doing it for nominations. They were not intending to undermine the filibuster itself, and consequently that 60 votes would continue to be the rule for either substantive legislation, or Supreme Court nominees. The question has arisen of whether that might change, whether the Senate Republicans might decide for some purposes, short-term, long-term, forever, to junk the filibuster and to start ruling the Senate with 51 votes. Mr. Hatch has been heard to say, no, no, never. We are in the minority more often than we're in the majority. I'm holding on to the filibuster. And that's as far as I know. Ann?
I think that's about right. I mean, I think we would hope that that wouldn't be the case, but this is unique times, so.
The only other thing I would point, I just want to make sure it's out there, that people always come back to the judges and
Yes.
the nominees. That wasn't the one that started it.
Okay.
It was Tom Coburn, and Coburn was.
Republican senator, no longer a member.
Senator from, doctor and senator from Oklahoma. Unique individual. Certainly not as crazy as now some of the newer folks, but in his day, he was considered the barbarian at the gate. Coburn figured out a way to make an amendment related to particulate matter germane post-cloture, and Reed could not live with being outfoxed by Coburn and changed the rule on the fly.
Okay.
That's where it started. The judges were a much longer type of conversation, but the ability to do something on the fly like that was evidenced first there.
Okay. So if the filibuster is maintained, it has to, anything without a direct effect on revenue or spending has to be done with 60 votes. A number of the provisions in the ACA do not have what we think has a direct effect on revenue or federal revenue or spending, including the insurance reforms as they apply to the private marketplace. Consequently, it was not included in last year's bill. If it were to pass if it were to be signed into law as last year's bill, the question I'm asking is, we'd have insurance reforms in the market, private market still on the books, but no subsidies and no mandate, which I think most right, left, and center health policy and health economist people think would collapse the private marketplace. And I don't just mean the exchanges. I mean the private marketplace that you and I are insured
The
in.
Republican comeback would be, yes, but we're going to do it. We've delayed it for 2 years,
Yeah.
and we're going to do it.
And who believes that? And that's going to be the conversation.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm highly signaled by Dr. Crowley that we should take a break now. So how long is the break?
We'll take a 5-minute break.
Okay.
And I need to do now what, for the whole semester, I think I've always messed up. I'm supposed to say at the beginning. These sessions are recorded. They're recorded during the break. If you want to have a private conversation, step outside. Remember, your mics are live, so
I won't go to the
duly
bathroom.
warned.
Thank you. See you in a few minutes.
I think, given the level of real threats.
No, you can't get some.
That's always, David Schwartz and I always used to say that, whoever in charge, you're going to flip the M, so it's the Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services.
Well, they just announced a new administrator who has only a primary Medicaid background.
Yeah.
That's the first time ever.
I'm trying to figure out how I know that. Her name is so familiar to me. And she was at Aspen. She went to
The thing that I've been, my wife did, she, from a background in resume, she remember, she's supposed to be over in the West Wing of the DPC. that's what put somebody in her as a resident. She's got no experience whatsoever in strength. She's never been in government. She's been a private contractor.
Not good. Not good.
Has nominal, if any, Medicare background. And again, the first M really is Medicare, and that's what they, I mean,
But she's not fighting against football. She's just-
I mean, they've just named the two top positions to be people with no administrative experience whatsoever. Well, what it does is it puts incredible interest in business, a lot of people who go in. And who are those people when they, how do they go in and fire them? God knows I would.
So, what are the politics like when we bring other people into this discussion? It's not just among senators. What was the second question?
The second one is, in this whole discussion, do we need to worry about Democrats
Okay.
supporting Medicaid? There's, you know, are they gonna figure it out?
Sophie's choice. Okay.
That is a check.
I did. I stayed here. I unexpectedly had the adult children of friends of mine who live in Denmark come to our house for Thanksgiving for a real American Thanksgiving. But they came with their 2-year-old too, so 2 30-year-olds and a 2-year-old. John.
This is great.
I feel like
Even more depressed.
I've been telling people, all my meetings are like doom and gloom. It's just
I had to do something, yeah. We need to know that John had a long history of having worked for both of them.
Medicaid waivers in the first term of the Clinton administration for HHS.
Do whatever time period. It's a theory. I could be wrong.
For the guardrails and for
I just don't know how to, because it seems to me the individualized.
You were a child.
No, I was there. I wasn't doing Medicaid at the time. The dish caps. Always astonishing to students. State by state numbers for how much dish money there is. And Andy describes it. She was on the Senate floor. The Middle Eastern bazaar. As members went by and named their price before they would vote for the dish
Because
cap.
everyone had been presented with the number that they.
Tennessee senators never were allowed to forget that they settled for dish.
well,
until NACRA. Until NACRA. Oh, actually, I don't know what it did for dish in Tennessee. What is that?
They basically
They
like.
gave Tennessee X amount of money?
I didn't need to not have dish.
Yeah, but they settled. The Tennessee senators said they didn't need
That's expiring
I didn't know that. Thank you.
Anyway, let's, Joe, for a second.
I meant to like write you out, thanks again for doing that event. I think people really enjoyed it. Sort of, my thoughts about all that changed.
Oh, okay.
So, right.
Yes, we, I had been traveling off before then, so we decided to stick around. I almost got derailed.
No, it's not.
You know, an interview got canceled. But I scheduled myself a couple of things. I started the week after election in Scottsdale and finished in Atlantic City, which are, not the same places. I took what, still with me in Atlantic City, so we stayed a couple of days there.
Caveat, they're allowed to, if they haven't had sex.
And you, where were you over Turkey Day? Where'd you go? Excellent.
So, I mean,
My kids go.
Well, nobody in my household desperately cares for turkey, so that's why we had Chinese.
One of my most painful memories was tension over which family was to go. I told my kids when they grew up.
Well, I'll just.
Don't worry about me and my family.
I think we're gonna get started again, and Professor Westmoreland said he was giving me the prerogative to ask the first question. So I had to.
Sadly, that's what they do.
So we were talking about.
Professor
They weren't
Monahan?
supposed to do that.
Professor Monahan,
How about you?
we're starting.
Now recording. Anyway. I've never quite seen that before, so anyway. No, so we had a discussion about reconciliation, and I was saying, from the tone of the conversation, I felt like it's a done deal, that what people are talking about is gonna happen. They're talking about a two-step reconciliation. I'm like, well, what about the politics? Forget about the process of how the Senate works. Where's the ARP? Where are all these lobbies of people that might say, hey, we're not happy if you turn Medicare into premium support or block grant the Medicaid program. So do we think they'll be able to do this so quickly before anybody can react, or will politics come into play?
I think that will happen faster than people can react. Although I also think that Republicans sort of have the out card, which is, okay, but this is on a delay. So, yeah, we did this, we said we were gonna do this, we're keeping our word, now we gotta roll up our sleeves and go to work. And I think there's no argument that I think that will blow them up that keeps them from going that route, but the next steps are gonna be hard. And that'll be the challenge.
So I think Rodney's right. I think to the extent that they use the reconciliation process and aren't really public about what their plans are in terms of replacement, it could limit the reaction. I think that we are actively engaging with stakeholders to remind them that it is important for them to engage in the process, that this is going to be more of a political year than we've seen in a very long time. And the political process is an important process. And so if they want to be part of that process, they should be engaging now. I think, we are concerned about a repeal without a replace. I think, we don't see how the market can stabilize. We don't really see how Medicaid directors can get behind a proposal that takes huge chunks of money out of their budgets with no plan for the future. And so, we've been encouraging them to the extent that they have those concerns to weigh in. Whether they do will be up to them.
One of the other questions that came up during the break that I'll ask Ann, because Ann and I are both acknowledgedly Democrats on this, so let's talk about some of the failings that Democrats can have sometimes. When it comes to big healthcare fights, sometimes Democrats choose between their children. Sophie's choice kind of thing of Democrats recognize that there's a lot more weight and a lot more constituency behind Medicare than behind Medicaid. And every now and then, I won't say always, but every now and then, people have to remind the Democrats that they care about this poverty program as well as the Medicare program. We're going to have that problem again when they're facing so many forced choices, and this lifeboat, it looks pretty small at this point. Are they going to have a hard time holding on to Medicaid as well as Medicare?
So I think what a lot of people don't realize, and sometimes what our job as staff to remind the members of, is the role of Medicaid in the healthcare system. Medicaid covers 1 in 5, soon to be 1 in 4 Americans, 72 million people every month. That's much more than Medicare. In addition, it is the primary long-term care insurance program for the United States. It pays for over half of long-term services and supports, 2 out of 3 people in nursing homes. It's the primary behavioral health system in the U.S., covering half of behavioral health services. And so part of our job is reminding the members about the role of Medicaid. And what I've found, especially lately, is when you remind them about the role of Medicaid, then they start, to the extent they weren't already thinking about it as a top priority, really appreciating the role it plays in our healthcare system. And so that's really our job as staff. It's really the job of stakeholders to remind folks, because I think you're right. I think people don't often, they're like, oh, that's that welfare program for poor people. And that's not the case, right? It covers half of births in the U.S., and it does a lot more than covering a few low-income people. And so will it be a challenge for some members? I think we'll continue to have to remind them about the importance, but given that it's a $500 billion a year program, billion with a B, I think the money involved, if nothing else, will help remind members why it's an important program.
I'll just quickly say, but I think the good thing you have coming is you won't have to make that choice. Repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act. Reform Medicare, reform Medicaid. Doing all 3 at once is insane, bordering on impossible. If they doubled the staff on the Hill, maybe. You literally, it can't be done. And you've been through the death marches, I've been through the death marches of the legislative, those odd year bills that were always the OBRAs, that we always do, and they're just literally, it becomes, there is the lack of intellectual space to handle it. ACA is getting done. Some form or fashion, Republicans are going to be in the ACA. So the question is, which of the other 2 more naturally fits with that conversation? It's absolutely Medicaid. Further, Medicare is much more controversial, and when the president-elect is already calling that out, I think Republicans, there's a high probability Republicans will go, we'll get to that later.
So,
But we'll see if I'm right.
so Medicare might be, even though the House Republicans are making lots of noises about Medicare, I'll call it reform for the time being, Medicare changes, that you think Medicare might be a bridge too far.
Absolutely, and just, this needs to get said, to be reminded, which is Republicans in the House have had nothing to do but make noise for 6 years now, and this is the first time they've actually have consequence to their noise. And so let's just see, once they start to realize that's their life, how they behave.
Okay. So let me turn to people in the audience now, one and then one, and we'll start.
Supposing that either through lots of infighting or procedural difficulties, or somebody has a conversation with the president-elect and explains what premium support is, and it sounds terrible to him actually, and he vetoes it or something, what could, independent of legislation, somebody like Tom Price, or I can't remember the name of the person who's the administrator for CMS, but what if there is no legislative, or if there's a delay anyway,
What kinds of things could be done without legislation?
Yeah.
Who wants to start talking 1115s, 1332s, and reg writing?
A lot.
CMMI. And Republicans have
Unpack.
have hated on the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation for years now. That it's the authority that they have to be able to construct demos, put them out in the world, even take them nationally, is inappropriate. It is an abuse of the executive legislative relationship. It is just bad for America until they get to wield the authority. And so that's gonna be a lot of fun to watch.
So I think CMMI is one, as Rodney pointed out. I think the Medicaid waivers, there's a lot of states that have asked for work requirements, for premiums for people below 100% of the poverty level, to lock people out if they don't pay into power accounts, other things like that. That the current administration has not allowed states to do due to a variety of consumer protection concerns and evidence that those things actually increase the number of people that forego coverage. In theory, a new administration could come in with a different interpretation. I know Tim mentioned 1332s and 1115s. The 1115 falls in that bucket. 1332 is about basically how can you use a waiver to rethink about how you use the premium tax credit subsidies. That would actually require the premium tax credit subsidies to be around. So I think that's a question of how that waiver works if those things aren't around. But in theory, there are some current guardrails around the use of those waivers from the current administration. Whether a new administration could come in with different guardrails is to be seen. I think it's also important to note that a new president can review recent regulations that have been released to the extent that he or she does not like those regulations. Start a process to try and roll them back. And so there's a lot of questions about what those regulations would be. And so I think there's a lot that they could do, whether through executive order, CMMI, waivers, getting rid of recent regulations, or making new regulations that are problematic from one angle or another.
Can I just, it's my own hobby horse, can I just take the power of the chair for 1 second and say, I think especially political types, and I travel in both circles, political types sort of think that you can just roll back regulations or withdraw guidance and just say, oh, oops, didn't mean that. And those of you who have taken administrative law will know that courts have interpreted the Administrative Procedures Act to say, if it's formal enough guidance and enough people have relied on it, you have to write a rule to take those things back. So I'm very wary of the kinds of things that Ann is describing, but I also want to make clear that I don't believe that the new CMS administrator or the new secretary can just come in and write a letter and say, oops, never mind. It will be a time-consuming and perhaps law-consuming process along the way. So,
I work at a big giant law firm, and so
a very good big giant law firm.
very much. I went around to a bunch of my lawyers to say, okay, the Administrative Procedures Act, I need to be much more coherent than I am on that. I'm just enough to be dangerous right now. And I think that what we agreed upon is that there's going to be lots of litigation. And that anything that's sub-regulatory, my guys feel like the authority is pretty limitless to say stop. And you may feel differently, but then once you're in actual regulatory, that's something that's been finalized in the CFR, then it is much more difficult, but then you bring in the Congressional Review Act, of which anything that was got finalized since May is in play. I mean, there's a lot to go on here. And if you guys talked about the bundling issue
Bundling issue?
of CRA, I still believe Republicans can do that. I've read the statute, and
I don't have the slightest idea what you're talking about.
So the Congressional Review Act allows Congress to say, start over. And, and now this.
To the
only
administration,
works-
say,
yeah, to the administration.
we don't like
Now,
this reg.
only works when the president will sign it. And the current president isn't signing anything that the current Congress is sending him, but the next one will. And so there are 150 plus major rules out there. And the debate, there's a real debate going on is, do you have to do them one at a time, or can you do them en bloc and still be able to have the status to be able to, to roll back the regs? I think that's going to be an interesting play early next year.
Okay.
Wonder, are there any proposals on the right that you're aware of that attempt to expand coverage or quality coverage? In that, I mean, even the examples you gave with late enrollment penalties would seem to provide less of an incentive, and if they didn't provide less of an incentive for young internals to get on, then they would probably be more unpopular than the individual mandate. So is there anything sort of in the Republican that looks like it might nudge in that direction?
No, I mean, I think that, to Tim's earlier question, I don't believe that any Republican is out there with a default that says cover more. And because there have been but a lot of it are political decisions. And, you know, if you look at the Better Way proposal, and it is clearly a political document. I think what.
Better Way is the House
the
Republican
House
proposal.
And so, I think that's but then when you are faced with actual cost and coverage consequences to your decisions, we'll see. And again, I think a lot of Republicans have very seriously subjective reality. You know, they have their own little echo chamber, you know, what's red state say? Did you listen to Heritage? Have you talked about Freedom Works? And, you know, there are a bunch of people talking to each other who actually don't do any of the real work. Now, when you actually have to roll up your sleeves and do real work, they're gonna be faced with those decisions. I'm telling people, do not set your default on horror. There are a lot of people out there who are gonna raise money on setting the default on horror. You know, Chuck Schumer's partying like it's 1995, talking about, you know, Metascare and, you know, you're trying to throw seniors off a cliff and stuff like that. I mean, but if you should actually work from the presumption that their default setting is not to do the worst possible thing, when actually faced with real decisions, not, here's a white paper.
Yes, sir.
In making that decision, how much do you think the factor of not wanting to admit that there are some things in the ACA that are pretty good, or that it did some things maybe better than the other future possibilities, like how hard will it be for Republicans to make that decision without kind of saying, okay, Obama did some things right. We've been criticizing this for 8 years, but it was actually.
I actually don't think it's hard at all oh, damn it, I'm mic'd. What I really wanted to say, listen, look who we just elected, okay? I mean, if you don't think people can't be convinced, I mean, this is P.T. Barnum stuff here. So you put the right label on it, you can basically repackage a whole lot of the Affordable Care Act. And, you know, just change the label on it, and you can convince a lot of people that you're actually, you know, getting rid of the damn thing.
I think there's a lot to be said about rebranding, and if there's one thing that Mr. Trump knows well, it's branding. The Trump steaks, the Trump wine, the Trump jewelry, the Trump hotels. And I do think there's a lot to be said about a lot that can be carried out that is rebranding without huge substantive change. Whether there's the will to do that is another question, which is why I keep coming back to the question of whether Republicans are aiming still to keep 20 million people covered, additional people. Yes, sir.
On that exact same point, what do you think the chances are of the president saying, I want to get rid of Obamacare, I don't want something in place where we fixed Obamacare and made it work, I want to replace it with Trump care, and I want this to be a legacy of mine. Is there any chance of that?
Sure, but it might end up working a hell of a lot like the Affordable Care Act, too.
Yeah, it might, I know.
Yeah. I mean, no, it's labeling, rebranding, totally get that.
Well, I mean, and the Democrats should know that as well, since the broad outline for the Affordable Care Act originally came from the Heritage Foundation.
You're not supposed to say that out loud.
We rebranded it to be about Mr. Obama, so now it could be rebranded to be.
Are you saying the Affordable Care Act was Romney 06, Bush 07, McCain 08, and Grassley 09? Dare you to say that out loud. You're not allowed to say that.
And Stuart Butler 03 or something like that, so yes. Okay, questions, comments, arguments, fits of rage.
Pick a fight, feel free.
Yes, ma'am.
What do the states do in the meantime who want to do innovative things in their states and I mean, outside of even just Medicaid, I mean, they want to do innovative things and they're just going to be further stymied. I mean, technology happens and.
Totally disagree.
No.
The answer is going to be yes.
States
And I've been telling folks in the Medicaid space that you need to presume that anything your state wants to do, the answer is yes in this new administration. Now, you need to be really concerned what the question was, but the answer is going to be yes. You know, can we put in work requirements? You know, yes. You know,
Can we spend more money
Yeah,
than
I
we would
think-
have spent under the current program?
I think the budget planning is where
That-
it's going to be the challenge.
That's going to be interesting. Tell me how you structure that conversation, I could get to yes on that.
Okay. Oh,
I mean, come
we're
on.
getting to
Again,
yes.
CMMI's authority is utterly ludicrous in terms of their ability to basically, look, damn microphone. The diabetes prevention program, which CMMI took and went national with, there's no way it saves money. There's just no way. CBO produced the data that showed that that particularly people who are obese, that there's just not enough of them to warrant giving the benefit across the entire spectrum. And they would have scored the bill in the tens of billions. And the CMMI got to click their heels together 3 times and say, saves money, we're doing it. And so you tell me that Republicans couldn't find a way to get there without authority? Oh, yes, they can.
So I think, if I can translate for Mr. Whitlock, Dr. Whitlock, quickly say, certainly if the question doesn't involve any new spending, that the states using current authority and current waivers can always expect the answer to be yes. And even if it does, Rodney says, potentially include new spending for diabetes prevention, for, I don't know, make it up, lead treatment, lead abatement, something like that, that there might be a way of finding it through some of the CMMI demonstration authorities that have billion. Now, they do have a fixed budget at CMMI. It's only.
They do, but again.
But they're not at it yet, but anyway.
But, and again, just take that, if we're playing, you guys like the politics of this stuff, the palace intrigue. Okay. The CMMI, the CMS administrator is going to be a healthcare consultant from Indiana. Okay. You might note that the vice president happens to be from a certain Midwestern state spelled Indiana. And so the fact that that individual is going to be in that role, I think if you look ahead to some of the fights that go on there, let's pick that one, which is the CMS administrator says, states, we want to give you authority to do this. Does an OMB director, the Office of Managed Budget, whose job it should be to review what is going on over, get the authority to go, oh hell no, that's crazy, you can't do that, when the CMS administrator came from where she did.
Fair question.
That's palace intrigue there. And so again, and you're totally right, Tim, to look at this and go, well, will they be able to do things where they're spending more money? Well, remember, it's not their money. It ain't like where Ann is, where you have to go through a process. When you produce legislation, you have to go to CBO, and they are hateful. They are difficult, they are mean, they are just not a lot of fun if they get in their mind that it's going to cost money, and you can't shout at them until you get there. Well, I know some people have made it work, but I mean, but over at CMS, you have the Office of the Actuary willing to behave. You have an OMB cowed down. You can do a lot.
So I will add to that by saying I think perhaps if you want to do short-term changes like work requirements or those things you want the short-term yes answer to, that could be possible. But I think to your point, if I'm a state and they've just repealed Medicaid expansion and I have no clue if half the people or a third of the people on my Medicaid program are gonna, if I'm gonna get my 90% or about 90% FMAP in the next 2 years, I think you have a good question about how can I plan for that? Children's Health Insurance Program covers 8 million kids across the US. It sits on top of the Medicaid program that also expires in September. I think it's very unclear when and if, what an extension of that program looks like for next year and if and when it happens next year. And so if I'm a state and do I need to start planning to send termination notices to these 8 million kids on this program? If I'm gonna run out of money in September, I'm supposed to send those out 3 months in advance. So that means I gotta start thinking about this summer if I have to start terminating this program. So I do question whether a state who's thinking about those things and facing those budgetary challenges can really be focusing a lot of attention on innovation. Senator Wyden's home state of Oregon is an extremely innovative state. They have 1 million people on Medicaid, 400,000 of which are on Medicaid expansion. So if half of my innovation state is going to be put at risk of losing coverage, I think you're right. Is a state going to be able to come up with that 90 cents when they've only been having to pay for a few cents? No.
Right.
And so I think, great, you can have work requirements, half your population's getting cut off your coverage. So I think that is a real question that states should be concerned about. Sorry, that's not very uplifting.
Just, I think, follow up on both of those. I'm still trying to, I totally agree with what your point about the states being in a position of not knowing what to do. I wonder just how much interest the Trump administration will have in saving money in Medicaid in the near term, right? I mean, a lot of this is about, I don't see where they're in the long run, sure, camping it down the road, but boy, I don't hear a lot of fiscal responsibility as part of the message here, so it's more about repeal and replace. And so maybe there's an interest here in letting, again, capping Medicaid somehow down the road, but in the near term, why wouldn't you say yes to everything, not just the work requirements, but to all the sort of the core features that we think about as Medicaid? Why wouldn't they do that as a way to cut a deal to buy off senatorial support?
I think, I'd be curious to get Ronnie's input. I think there is a tension between what the Trump administration might be comfortable with and what Paul Ryan might be comfortable with.
No question, no.
And at the end of the day, the budget reconciliation bill is coming from, probably going to start in the House, head over to the Senate, and then it goes to the president's desk. And so I think to the extent that you've had these fiscal conservatives who have been in leadership positions whose primary mantra has been, I want to cut $2 trillion out of the program over the next 2 years or next 10 years. Even if they can't get the full trillion, they're probably going to shoot for a few $100 billion. And so I don't know that there's a way to do that and then also do those other things. I don't know, Ronnie, if you have any.
I think from a congressional standpoint, they only care about the fiscal side. I mean, it's the primary, and there's no 2, 3, or 4 on the list. But where the administration is concerned, I'm not convinced that they are playing under the same set of rules, and they don't have to. This is not a world where I think you have any fear of a budget committee chairman hauling the OMB director in to say, "What are you all doing here?" Although it could happen if things go badly enough. Listen, repeal and replace has to be legislative in nature, but things that are regulatory in nature, I do not rule out this administration looking at the use of dollars very differently.
Now, I would add, in part answer to your question, that playing around in the background of this is the federal debt ceiling expires in mid-March. And there are members of the House and the Senate, Republican members of House and Senate, who've said they will not vote to raise the debt ceiling, which of course will send stock markets and bond markets worldwide crashing if we don't do that. What I have to say again, Secretary Rubin, when he was Treasury Secretary, said not raising the debt ceiling when it's needed is the fiscal equivalent of a nuclear bomb. But there are a number of members who said they won't vote for that unless they have budget cutting measures in place in exchange. That $1 trillion of new money on the debt means $1 trillion in cost savings out of the budget, those kinds of statements. So starting in March, practically before the House and the Senate are fully organized, we're going to have this huge, massive debate about budget and fiscal restraint. So. Yes, sir.
I keep coming back to politics, and this is all tea leaves and crystal balls, I realize, but give that example. How much is the Democratic Party going to be willing to bail out the Republicans when things like that come up? How much are the Democrats going to be able to go with the minority of the Republicans to get the debt ceiling raised, for example? So all the Republicans can go back and say, you voted against it and scream about it. To what extent are we going to have a Democratic Party that sort of the Republicans? I mean, is there a new political dynamic now where the Democrats are going to be more like the Republicans were in the last 70 years, trying to make everything go bad?
So I
And
think.
to what extent are the Republicans going to look at a different constituency? Are they going to go with their traditional constituencies, or are they now looking at the rural, white, middle-class, lower-class voters and seeing that as a constituency they really have to pay attention to?
So I'd say although the Republican Party has been the party of disruption for many years, I don't think that Democrats are naturally inclined to blow up the economy or have people lose their health insurance. And so I
I'm
think,
hard pressed to think of the Democratic Ted Cruz.
yes. So I think that,
Bernie Sanders? Elizabeth Warren?
She won't
Okay.
bring down the economy.
Okay.
Never mind, I'm sorry, Ann, I interrupted you. I apologize.
but I think that, right, that's the point. So I think you raise a good point, right? Because that's kind of a fundamental, there's a fundamental difference, I think, about where Democrats are willing to go. But I would change it because I think it's less so, I think it's more of, if the Democrats are willing to raise the debt ceiling, are we gonna get some of their moderate Republicans to go along with us? Like, we know we're not gonna blow up, but are they gonna blow it up? And so I think that's all to be determined and kind of how that process works itself out. Because although there's a lot of things that can happen in reconciliation, they can't do everything in reconciliation. And so there are gonna be things that are gonna require, assuming we don't have dramatic changes of the rules on every single thing, 60 votes. And we've had this issue for a long time, and what has led to is a lot of deadlock in Congress and a lot of Americans saying that they don't think Congress acts. And I think there's concern about whether that will continue to be the case or not. But in some of these cases, it could be.
I'm sorry, Jeff, go ahead.
This is going to change the subject. So.
Okay, well, I was going to follow along that just a little bit and ask what I think is a hard question for us Democrats. In 2 years, there are like 25 Democratic senators up for election, many of them from very conservative states. Some of them are going to feel, facing a red state that they've been elected from, that they're going to have to undo gridlock in part. Are we going to, is that where the votes are going to come from the red state Democrats who are worried that their election's coming up and that they have to look cooperative?
So I think it depends what the proposal is, right? If their proposal is to dismantle their state Medicaid program that 1 in 4 of their constituents rely on, that's probably going to be a problem. If their proposal is to do some tweaking around the margins that their state's okay with, and maybe they don't love, but they can get behind, that's another conversation. And so I think part of it is, and to Rodney's point of don't worry about all the things they're saying, just worry about what they do. Well, we can, right now, all we have is the things they're saying. And so if they're saying they're gonna block grant Medicaid, and they're saying they're gonna repeal the ACA, and they're saying they're gonna privatize Medicare, I sure hope that they're calling in the insurance companies and having a conversation with them, but as best as I know, that is not happening right now, or at least not in a more substantive manner. And so I think it all just depends what the deal is that they're trying to pull the other side from. If it's a bad deal, they're not going to want to vote for it regardless.
What I would say is that in healthcare, I think that it's harder to see this going on the D side. In other issues, it may be an entirely different conversation. I mean, Heidi Heitkamp cannot come back here following Elizabeth Warren. She won't make it back. So some of their folks are going to have to be able to carve out that they're not fully into the more progressive side of the party. But I don't think it's going to be in healthcare.
Okay, Jeff?
So I want to ask about long-term services and supports, and I don't know your engagement on this, but you, Tim, have worked, Rodney, our engagement has been trying to think creatively on this. Forward, backward, a muddle, and just for the class, I don't know if you know what long-term services are, it's often called long-term care, so people that need help with activities of everyday living. We don't really, as a country, have a good way to deal with this. We have some private long-term care insurance, doesn't work well, people don't have access to it. And we really sort of force a lot of people to rely on Medicaid, even though Medicaid wasn't built for this. So the question, and then there's this idea of demographic changes. Are we eventually as a country going to have to deal with this? And both Tim and Rodney have spent a lot of time trying to think, how do we move forward in a bipartisan way? So what do the next few years look like?
Full disclosure, I am working with a coalition on this particular subject. The challenge under this electoral outcome is going to be to help Republicans understand that the absolute worst thing you can do is further disconnect Medicaid from Medicare. So that if you tell states, okay, here's a big bag of money, good luck, you're actually further separating Medicare, the acute benefit, from the LTSS benefit. And if you look at our spending in that space, where we spend the most money, is on those dually eligible, the frail elders, who are very expensive and are in transitions, and the programs are horribly misaligned. And the worst thing you do is actually exacerbate that. And so that will be the challenge to get Republicans to understand that. Now, will they be to the point that they're talking, and what will they be talking about that allows them to actually understand that? But certainly for the over 65 population, it makes no sense for the separation to exist at all.
I think for us, we would love to engage in a conversation about long-term care. I think, there's a lot of people focused on the sustainability of Medicaid, sustainability of Medicare. And we want to have those conversations, but we don't believe that block granting Medicaid or privatizing Medicare is going to do anything to help the sustainability. In fact, we think it's going to hurt the sustainability of the programs. If we really want to help the sustainability of the programs, we need to address long-term care, we need to address drug pricing, and a lot of these other issues. And so, that being said, we have a lot of things on the healthcare agenda this next Congress. They want to completely reform the private healthcare system. They want to reform Medicaid. They want to reform Medicare. At least this is what they're saying publicly, as I said. This is all we can rely on. And so whether there'll be any energy, whether from a staff level or just from how many days we're in Congress and floor time, to do anything on long-term care, I just can't imagine that could be on the agenda moving forward, given everything else they want to do in the healthcare space.
Go ahead.
I would say, Jeff, that I think the answer to that question of where we can go in long-term services and supports over the next couple of years is in the answer that Rodney just gave to this woman in the back, which is, if you're a state, the answer is yes. And so I think there'll be interesting things for states to do, but my guess is that Anna's right, that we don't have the intellectual or financial space to do anything federal right now.
And I'm just going to poke at you a little bit on that, which is Medicare privatization. Right? So some might say that the expansive use of Medicare Advantage as a benefit of doing it under a privately held model is private in nature. It's not all the way over to premium support, but we do a lot of that. And for people who talk about Medicaid as, how on earth could you possibly do it on a per capita cap? Arguably, states are doing a hell of a lot of per capita capping with Medicaid managed care. So it's just, I don't think there are black and whites as clear between those as I think a lot of people would like to presume. There's gray there.
And I think that goes to Rodney's point. I think there's this intellectual conversation about how can you think about the healthcare system. Is Medicaid financing work perfectly? No. When we have a recession, it requires Congress to act, and that's not a super effective mechanism. And we've had the Government Accountability Office say, hey, we could be doing better here. But I think there's the intellectual conversation, and then there's the reality that so far what we're seeing is purely political, purely budgetary-driven decisions that are not focused on how we can better design these programs to serve the needs of states and beneficiaries, but are focused on how we can reduce the entitlement, eliminate the entitlement in some cases, and reduce the federal budget. And I think it's more of under those circumstances that I speak to the sustainability of the programs.
This is extremely atypical of me. I'm generally not glass half full of sunshine versus glass half full of battery acid. And the truth is, I'm generally the more cynical person around here, but I still benefit of the doubt until shown otherwise. And I think, but you're also right where you're saying, which is, okay, but everything to this point is said, okay, let's burn the place down.
Yeah.
And I don't disagree with that.
Yes, Jeff.
Do something almost dangerous.
It's your course. Of course you can.
For those of you, these people work mostly on domestic health programs, but about half of our students are foreign students. This is our only class really to hear about after the election, people working on health. Some of you may have questions about the impact on health programs. They may not be the staff people that work on these issues per se, but they're engaged on the Hill. So I don't know if any of you are just wondering, what does this mean for some of our global health programs? So I just wanted to give you a chance to ask questions. Or not. Maria, no.
That's actually the question. Like, I don't know if you know if the intention is to continue supporting the programs, to cut the budget. There's so many programs that considering that the United States is
It's going to be, it will be budgetary trade-offs. and who's in charge and how far they're willing to push it is going to drive a lot in that space. And I wish I could tell you the answers. I think a lot of folks do understand the importance of that. It's can they continue to win the conversation under this alignment? I don't know the answer.
And then I was gonna, I'm not an international health expert, but what I will say is I do cover the women's health portfolio. And I think that we've seen a number of decisions made to kind of undermine what we would say is programs that provide access to women's health and reproductive health. We saw the defunding of Planned Parenthood through the Medicaid program as part of the budget reconciliation bill. We've seen some, what we would call poison pill riders attached to some appropriations bills around kind of limiting certain international programs that focus on women's health. And so for us, I think that's an area that we will be keeping a close watch on and something that we are really concerned about.
I'm not an international health person either, I'm quick to say, especially in this room, but I have a sort of overarching thing to say in response, which is if you add up Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, the Defense Department, and interest on the debt, that's 90% of our federal budget right there. And Social Security's off the table. Rodney's saying Medicare may be off the table. President Trump wants to increase defense spending. We can't change interest on the debt without shaking the markets. So all of these discussions about finding cuts in the federal budget over the next 10 years have to come from the 10% that's left. Because Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, defense, interest on the debt make up like 90% of the federal budget. And there are a lot of people who are giving speeches saying, I want to cut the budget without thinking of those issues. They don't want to cut defense. They can't cut interest. They can't cut Social Security right now. They might be able to cut Medicaid, but not as much as they're talking. So I think the pressure on discretionary programs like this is going to be incredible to cut those programs, especially those that don't have a voter constituency for members who are up for election. So without knowing anything about international health, I think the domestic politics of it is going to make it very hard to keep those programs at the same level they are now. Do you guys? Oh, and actually, Professor Monahan may have some other views on this too.
I agree with everything that you all said. I think the pressure on the discretionary side of the budget is going to be enormous. I think within the category of overseas development or assistance, another label for that would be programs that don't have immediate voter
constituencies.
Global health, my guess is will do relatively better to some other development programs. Historically, global health has tended to have more bipartisan support than say, other development assistance initiatives. I do think there's going to be a huge pressure on just general overseas development support in the U.S. I think within that box, health will do relatively better, at least it has done historically better. Now, whether that certainly will put a huge, I don't want to be a Pollyanna about it because there's huge needs, particularly around the global HIV increasing needs on tuberculosis, global health security, all those things that are funded through the discretionary side of the budget that where needs are increasing, dollars will be decreasing. But I think global health has historically done better than others.
So there, someone who actually does do international health thinks that it may be slightly better for global health than it is for everything else in that portfolio. Yes.
Just sort of unpacking then the 90% that you were talking about, Professor. A lot of that is in the Defense Department, but the Defense Department is a major contributor to the health care of Americans and globally speaking as well. I mean, the Veterans Administration, which is a separate department, of course, but they run one of, if not the largest socialized health systems that exist, more or less effectively. But I'm wondering, when they're talking about cuts and when they're trying to make these cuts, but wanting to increase DOD and maybe like VA's budgets, are they looking at the, like, the mini pieces that fall under these acronyms? Or is it like, we'll just throw $10 trillion at DOD and maybe at the VA and pretend that they aren't a part of the national health apparatus or the global health apparatus? That's it.
You guys want to start?
Well, yeah, the appropriations process, typically, the appropriators will, they don't earmark, it's not allowed anymore, but they do provide certain categories of funding. So it's not, here's a big bag of money, tell us how it turns out. To sort of Professor Monahan's comment earlier, one of the things I think we'll see, which is you change certain people in certain places, and maybe it doesn't turn out that way. And so if the next, subcommittee chair actually doesn't give a crap, the next thing you know, the numbers might not look that way. And that's, I think, one of the issues with Specter and Harkin ain't here no more. And so appropriators a while ago used to be, okay, great, it's Christmas, we get to be Santa Claus and give out money left and right. And those days have changed. Down to specific programs, it's that interaction between the authorizer saying, here's what we need money for, and the appropriators filling the glass with money/water. The water glass analogy when I teach that.
And I would say that the budget outside of those programs I laid out, so the 10% that's left over, is governed by some budget rules that split between defense security and non-defense. And so the VA will be over there in the non-defense side. The defense security will include, depending on who's counted and how, the Pentagon plus Homeland Security. And the VA has its own voter constituency, so there will be money going towards that, I believe, which will make it only tighter for those other programs within the non-defense 10% that's there. And it's been clear that people want to raise the defense discretionary, so it's just going to make that pressure even worse over there.
We need like an uplifting note, maybe.
Yeah, we do need an uplifting note.
This is how I've been ending all of my meetings for about 3 weeks.
Well, let's talk about one that might be uplifting, and that certainly you guys have had some experience, we've all had some experience with, and that I actually believe will work out, which is reauthorization of the Children's Health Insurance Program. The program expires at the end of this federal fiscal year. Most states work with budgets that start on July 1, so they need to know even sooner than that. The program's godfather from the outset was Orrin Hatch of Utah. And I myself don't think that the first act that the Republican Congress wants to be seen to do is throw lots of low-income children into the status of being uninsured. So do you think we're going to be able to renew the Children's Health Insurance Program at least for a year or two in the short run?
I think we will be able to continue it. I think there's a lot of bipartisan support for it. I think what it looks like is the question. Do they renew it and then they come back with a Medicaid restructuring and then they want to wrap it in? If they renew it, how long do they renew it for? Do they get rid of, there's an enhanced federal matching rate, do they get rid of that? There's a maintenance of effort provision on states saying that they can't cut kids off through 2019. Do they get rid of that? Absolutely. But do they get rid of that, which I think we have a lot of concerns with? There's been a lot of interest right now. 95% of kids in CHIP are below 200% of the federal poverty level, but some states do cover up to 400%. There's been a lot, majority really does not like the fact that, a few thousand kids are above that 200% threshold, so do they put a cap on it? So I think it does continue. I think the question is, what does it look like, and when does it happen? And I think that's all open for discussion.
Dr. Whitlock?
Grown-ups look at this as there are effectively 3 programs available to a child from an income of roughly 133 to 250. Just grant me that.
Percent of poverty.
Percent of poverty. And that is, you can get coverage through your parent in employer-sponsored insurance. You can coverage through your parent in an exchange or marketplace-based coverage, or you can get coverage essentially for yourself in CHIP. Setting aside the family glitch, that's a problem unto itself. Why are they different? What are the differences between them? Does it make public policy sense for there to be 3 programs? Why is it that a kid in CHIP gets something that a kid in ESI does not? mean, I think grown-ups look at that conversation and solve it. I don't think that's happening this year. I think it's the 2-year extension, but I've been telling people for years now, 19, it's over. And so in 19, you better have the answer to that question, that you better know what you want the answer to that question to be by 19. Because after that, the maintenance effort is going away. And I'm not even certain that you can extend the maintenance effort under, under NFIB versus civilians.
Well, that's a different question. Even though we're in law school, let's hold on to that
Oh,
thought. But I was trying to come up with an uplifting ending to it. So can I try to distill a little bit out of it, which is you think it will be extended. Also, you think it will be extended for at least 2 years. And so the Children's Health Insurance Program will probably keep going for another couple of years while we work out what's going to happen with adult people who need government assistance for health insurance.
I mean, I thought that the obvious uplifting moment was healthcare absolutely is a fertile place for billable hours in your future. Do you need to know anything other than that?
True.
Well, I have been telling students for some time now that in health law student class, people were saying, oh, do I still have a job? And I said, oh my gosh, you guys are fully employable for the next 20 years straightening out this mess. Now, whether you're going to like what you do during the day is another question, but you're fully employable. So I guess that may be the sort of middle level uplift. I was going to try with something children's health insurance related, but let me instead thank you both for coming. I really appreciate it. I'm grateful to you for doing it.